Good morning.
Good morning.
I'd like to introduce our guest speaker today, Carol Iwata, who is coming to us on Zoom. Carol practices at Clouds in Water Zen Center in St. Paul. She received jukai there in 2011. She was the chair of their board for several years. She's a coordinator at Clouds of the BIPOC Sitting Group Sangha and a founding member of the Race, Love, and Liberation Laboratory, which works to grow more spiritual things led by and for people of color. And she's worked on social justice programs of various kinds and community building for a long time here in the cities. She co-founded several Asian American community building organizations in the Twin Cities. She's also part of the coordinating team for Deep Listening for Social Change, which is a peaceful social change movement initiated by members of the Twin Cities BIPOC mindfulness community. And so happy to have you here, Carol. We've been talking about this for a long time, and it's just great to finally have you here in the Zendo. So thanks for coming.
Yes, it has been a long time, Ted, that we've been discussing this. Good morning, Minnesota Zen Center and guests. Some of the guests today are from the meditation and discussion group at Clouds and Water Zen Center's group, a sitting group for Black, Indigenous, and people of color. And I'm sending a great big smile in your direction. I want to thank Minnesota Zen Center, especially Ben Connolly and Ted O'Toole, for your invitation to talk and for your efforts to diversify the voices that channel the Dharma. Also, congratulations to MZMC on your 50th anniversary. Thank you for all the teaching and practice that has flowed from the work of MZMC and your founder, the teacher who brought Soto Zen to Minnesota, Dainin Katagiri Roshi. The title of my talk this morning is BIPOC Buddhism and the Erasure of Asian Americans in American Buddhism. I am passionate about applying spiritual practice toward the work of social and racial justice. I am animated in this by the chant that Buddhists perform in our morning services. Wrapping ourselves in Buddha's teaching, we free all sentient beings. I have not been a Buddhist activist forever, but now that I am, I want to talk about how American Buddhism became white Buddhism, how Buddhism as practiced by people of color in the US is different from American white Buddhism, and of how Asian Americans were erased from American Buddhism. First, I want to acknowledge some of the unsung peoples who contributed hugely to the fullness of the United States. By now, many of us have heard or even said that we live on land stolen from the Dakota and the Anishinaabe peoples who still live among us and are still not treated with respect. For centuries, they took loving care of this land that so enticed the white settlers of Minnesota. Let's ask ourselves, what are we doing for those still living among us, besides acknowledging that we wronged their dead ancestors? I know that some here work with Indigenous people, and we all need to look at how we can support our contemporary Indigenous relatives. Next, let's acknowledge the Black, Indigenous, Asian, Hispanic, and other brown peoples and marginalized white people who were enslaved or whose labor was essentially stolen, and whose backbreaking work and community making have built so much of this modern nation. And finally, in our acknowledgments, let us be mindful that we Buddhists owe our spiritual traditions to Asians who brought Buddhism to the United States in the 1800s and 1900s. These include my grandparents, Seiji and Masuko Iwata, who arrived in the early 1900s and practiced Nichiren Buddhism their whole lives. And now, to start, here is how this particular activist became a Buddhist activist. I was first drawn to mindfulness and Buddhism when I was a Peace Corps volunteer in West Africa. I happened to find a book written by a Christian priest who became Buddhist. I hung short Buddhist sayings on the doors of my rented rooms, and when my African students came over to study, they loved chanting them. After returning to the United States, I eventually gravitated toward Clouds and Water Zen Center. However, my activism and Buddhist practice were on two different tracks in my life. I had been a racial and social justice activist while in college and through my adult life, but felt the need to keep that part of my life quiet in a Buddhist community. This was similar to how I kept my progressive views and my sexuality under wraps at my workplace. I couldn't figure out how to bring my social and racial justice work into a practice that seemed very white and individually focused. The reason that I didn't feel my activism was compatible with Buddhist practice is that I didn't have the experience of my whole self being welcome among white Buddhists. But I stayed with my Buddhist practice because it helped me to work with my own suffering and to be compassionate with others who suffered, especially regarding my hugely dysfunctional family I grew up in. So I ignored the disconnect for a while. During the middle 2000s, I found other Buddhists of color. First, I went to a day-long retreat produced by people of color who were connected with clouds. The retreat was led by Riomon Gutierrez Baldoquin, the founder of the People of Color Sitting Group at San Francisco Zen Center. This was the first event, the first Buddhist event for people of color that I had ever been to. The next People of Color event I participated in was a Thich Nhat Hanh retreat in Deer Park, California, where I cried as I connected to my ancestors. For a few years, some white allies and some people of color tried to organize BIPOC projects at Clouds. We had a lot of meetings, but it was difficult to get traction. Being an activist person of color and a Buddhist all came together in a powerful way when a few of us people of color at Clouds and Water brought Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams to St. Paul in 2017. She led a multi-day workshop, including a day for BIPOC participants only. Reverend Angel, for those of you who don't know, is an ardent, activist, Black, queer, Buddhist priest, and author and organizer who is doing her darndest to help people of all colors to claim liberation. So many people of color who talked about that event afterwards and many people who wrote in the event's evaluation forms said this was truly a transformative event. People of color participants cried, shouted with joy, and felt heard and seen and mirrored back. Those of us who produced the workshop were so energized that we didn't want to stop feeling the joy. So we started the BIPOC Sitting Group at Clouds and Water that now meets for meditation and discussion from the heart every week and 2 Sundays each month. As I found a few people of color to practice with, I felt more emboldened to work on making people of color more visible and full-voiced in local Buddhist communities. I can hardly describe to you how breathtaking and moving it is, that it feels like coming home, to be able to practice with people who are Black and brown and who understand in our DNA the experience of generations of being marginalized and who share forms of practice that arise from our heritage. And we are not a monolithic identity. There are a lot of cultures that aren't white, and one of the ways we grow in our practice is by opening to the lessons that people from different cultures bring. As I started working with Buddhists that I felt more allied with, I began to see more clearly where my sense of disconnection was coming from. How American Buddhism was not seeing and not hearing how Black, Indigenous, and people of color had different needs and different ways of spiritual practice than white people. I want to note here that I'm talking about Buddhism as practiced in the United States, whether by white people or people of color. I'm not talking about Buddhism practiced anywhere else in the world. To many people of color, American Buddhism is white Buddhism because Buddhism, as practiced in much of the US today, has tended to focus on practices that seem most comfortable to white folks. A major example of this is individual practice, especially the step of the Eightfold Path called concentration. I think that this focus on self-improvement through meditation was used to sell Buddhism to many white folks. You sit on your cushion, you meditate, you work on your stuff. You don't have to deal with the messy parts of the world that you left outside the zendo. I have heard Buddhist practitioners say that they don't come to a zendo to deal with issues of the world. But this singular focus on concentration, on zazen, which is a beautiful practice, but not meant to be isolating, can cause harm and sometimes very grave harm. Lama Rod Owens talks about the time he was suffering greatly as a Black queer man, feeling very out of place and not treated respectfully in a predominantly white Sangha. When he talked with the teacher about his pain, the teacher instructed him to spend more time on his cushion and work on his suffering through meditation. In other words, dealing with racism and homophobia was his problem. In my experience, BIPOC Buddhism in the United States is different from Buddhism that's practiced in a white framework. This is a curious evolution. Buddhism originated in Asia, and so many Americans saw it as a foreign and pagan cult through the 1950s. How did Buddhism become so white in the United States? I think that Buddhism, BIPOC Buddhism, and Buddhism practiced through a white framework diverged for two key reasons. People of color practice with an awareness of race and with a strong focus on community. Black, Indigenous, and people of color are very conscious of race and racism in our lives, which includes our spiritual practice. Awareness of race is part of our practice. It's inescapable. It's in our bodies. Buddhism that is practiced from a white framework doesn't pay attention to the experience of race or racism, or for that matter, a lot of isms. Or white frame Buddhism relegates awareness of race to the delusion of duality or self, that is, versus oneself or non-self. As I mentioned earlier, focusing on meditation and shutting out the cares of the world during spiritual practice applied to a lot of white people, appealed to a lot of white people. People of color practice in community, sometimes with food or song or dance, but definitely in connection with others. In a Lion's Roar forum that I participated in earlier this year, Buddhist teacher La Sarmiento said of their first BIPOC Buddhist gathering, there was a sense of connection versus just a bunch of people sitting in a room together doing their own thing. It's very collectivist. La Sarmiento also said, we, meaning people of color, need one another to survive. My strongest sense of belonging with my whole self to a spiritual community happens when I am practicing with other BIPOC mindfulness practitioners. I am so grateful to the folks in the BIPOC Sitting Group at Clouds and Water, and to the BIPOC activists in my other mindfulness-based projects for the opportunity to practice with such expansiveness. Buddhists who practice out of a white framework may talk about the importance of spiritual practice in community, but may not actively foster connections. On the other hand, the members of the BIPOC Sitting Group at Clouds and Water actively help one another even when they're not located in the same part of the country as someone in need, or even when they don't know them, but when an appeal to the BIPOC Sitting Group just goes out. I think that we build this strong a community when we feel safe enough to share intimate experiences, including our needs. I see it as a real challenge that most Buddhist communities seem pretty passive, even if well-meaning, in creating safe spaces for BIPOC practitioners where social issues can be voiced and heard. The emphasis seems to be on having one community, which means fitting into the larger white dominant Sangha. But as a person of color, I can't assume that it's safe to be vulnerable with people who might react with judgment or voyeurism. I've heard several white practitioners say they wish they could be in our Sangha's people of color group. They say they want to hear our experiences. That is voyeurism. As far as judgment goes, when I wrote a description several years ago for the Sangha's newsletter about the BIPOC Sitting Group, stating that it's for BIPOC people that practice with one another, a white practitioner wrote an email saying that I needed to get over my hatred of white people. Creating BIPOC spaces is for me about ending suffering for all beings and springs from love, absolutely not hate. It is so painful to see that this work is interpreted as being about hate. There are other feelings that I have about that too. In every Buddhist community that I'm in, I am aware of being in a small minority. When I enter a service or retreat, I automatically, out of habit, count the number of people of color. If there are 4 BIPOC people out of 60 in a gathering, I feel guarded, not completely safe. Lots of people of color count in so many situations we find ourselves in, including Sanghas. I know that women also look around the room and count in some places, as do LGBTQ plus people. Are there situations you find yourself in where you count how many people might be your allies or who might be safer for you? If you ever have to count, think about what it's like to always have to count. That's life for a person of color. I think that it's critical for all of us to see ourselves in what's being presented. For people of color, this means that Sanghas need to offer programming that reflects realities other than just white ones, and to have community leaders who aren't all white. This must go beyond tokenism or photos of faces that will look good on the website. There needs to be active support and mentoring of BIPOC leaders. By this, I mean board members, key volunteers, and especially teachers. On a hopeful note, I am excited to see the beginnings of a people of color group here at MZMC. I've talked about my journey as a Buddhist activist and some ways that American Buddhism doesn't work for people of color. Now I want to describe how American Buddhism has whitewashed its Asian and Asian American roots. This is really sickening, especially to Asian Americans, and I am one. Here is a fundamental error that's an example of whitewashing. I have heard so many American Buddhist leaders trace the roots of Buddhism in America to Suzuki Roshi's emergence in the 1960s as the founder of San Francisco Zen Center. In Lion's Roar, which I think is the major Buddhist publication in the United States, the December 2017 issue was paying tribute to Suzuki Roshi. Here's what the article said. Shunryu Suzuki Roshi has had an enormous influence on the growth of Buddha Dharma in the West. Yet when he came to San Francisco in 1959, he had no plans, no grand strategy, only a bottomless confidence in the power of the Dharma. He sat zazen every morning in his temple alone until gradually some American students began to join him. It all grew from there: the San Francisco Zen Center, Tassajara Monastery, the publication of Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, many ordained disciples, scores of lay disciples, thousands of followers. OMG, no, this is romanticized BS. There is a different and true story, and I thank my friend and Buddhist scholar, Dr. Jake Nagasawa, for educating me. Suzuki Roshi came to the US to minister to an already functioning Buddhist temple in San Francisco called Sokoji, which was founded in 1934 by Japanese Americans. Sokoji was closed during World War II, clearly because its members were in the U.S. internment, that is, concentration camps. Sokoji reopened in 1948, and Shunryu Suzuki was assigned there in 1959 as the temple priest. He didn't have to sit alone until some American students began to join him. There were already Americans in his temple, namely these Japanese Americans. In addition to the local Japanese American practitioners that Suzuki Roshi came to the U.S. to serve, counterculture white folks, hippies, beatniks, etc., flocked to Buddhism. Shunryu Suzuki established a Zen center at Sokoji for non-Japanese speaking members to practice meditation. And these non-Japanese members eventually outgrew Sokoji and formed San Francisco Zen Center. Suzuki Roshi later moved to San Francisco Zen Center to become its leader in 1969. Even recently, I have heard American Buddhists refer to the spiritual practices of the early white converts as earnest or more serious Buddhism, which they contrast with the cultural Buddhism practiced by Asian American settlers. I know that MZMC has a special connection to the Jodo Shinshu community called the Twin Cities Buddhist Sangha, and I wonder if some might see their practice as cultural Buddhism instead of as an insight to our roots. As I mentioned in my acknowledgement earlier, Buddhism was actually brought to the US in the 1800s and 1900s with Chinese and Japanese laborers. It was protected and nourished during World War II by Japanese and Japanese Americans during their incarceration. This is how Buddhism survived to get passed down to us in the US. Reverend Duncan Williams was a guest at MZMC several years ago, and he taught us that Japanese Buddhists, especially the priests and leaders, were monitored and targeted by the US government even before war was declared. They were the first ones arrested among the Japanese and Japanese Americans who were incarcerated during World War II. The Japanese and Japanese American Buddhists were persecuted because they were leaders of a foreign, that is non-Christian, religion. There was a lot of pressure applied to both adults and children to convert to Christianity. Children were told that they would never see their parents if they didn't convert. My mother's family weren't Buddhists. My father's family were. My father's parents, at least. My mother's family weren't Buddhist. They were convert Christians. I think that my mother's parents practiced Shinto before the Catholics got to them. But being Christians certainly didn't save them. They were also incarcerated with other Japanese Americans on the West Coast. My family's experience of persecution for being Japanese did a lot to ignite my racial justice activism, to work to resist the treatment of people in our society as other. Here's another coat of whitewash from Tricycle Magazine, which is another leading Buddhist publication. In the 1990s, Tricycle founder and then editor Ellen Twerkov wrote an editorial where she stated, quote, Asian American Buddhists number at least 1 million, but so far they have not figured prominently in the development of something called American Buddhism, end quote. Reverend Ryo Imamura wrote a letter in rebuttal to that editorial. He pointed out that his grandparents and other Asian immigrants brought and implanted Buddhism in America 100 years prior, despite white intolerance and bigotry. Because of the same intolerance and bigotry, his American-born parents and their generation helped to foster Buddhism even though they had to practice discreetly in hidden temples and in concentration camps. It was also Asian Buddhists who welcomed many white Americans into their temples, introduced them to the Dharma, and often helped them to initiate their own Sanghas when they felt uncomfortable practicing with Asian Americans. But Tricycle never published his response. That's how national media has erased the Asian roots of Buddhism. In many American Sanghas, a very routine way that American Buddhists erase our Asian American heritage is when they use Asian forms and practices and ceremonies, all without paying respect to their Asian roots and sometimes denying them. These forms and practices include bowing, priest robes, dharma names, priest names, chants, texts, bowls, and other objects for sounds, temple architecture or furnishings, etc. To an Asian American, this is like being in some strange drama where mostly white people are play acting at being Japanese. I don't have a problem at all with adapting Buddhism to various cultures. This is done in every country where Buddhism has a significant following. It's the erasure of history, the lack of recognition, and not claiming our lineage and microaggressions, by the way, that troubles me. Even when Buddhists have simplified their ceremonies and don't use many of the traditional forms, we should not deny that our practices were brought to us and were protected during World War II by Asians and Asian Americans. In closing, I have some comments about the work ahead for all of us. I am committed to saving all beings. I work with people, white people, who have done serious anti-racism work. I have meetings with them, I have lunch, tea, but I don't have endless energy. I do feel that I need to take care of BIPOC communities foremost. I believe that racism will end when white people decide to end it. I don't think it's the responsibility of BIPOC people to figure out how to change the hearts and minds of those who practice Buddhism through a white framework. BIPOC practitioners can't make ourselves feel safe. We can't make ourselves be seen or heard. We can make noises, but do they register? There are things that white Buddhists have to work on themselves. How have they, consciously or unconsciously, contributed to making people who are different, whether they're from a different racial group, or queer, or people with disabilities, or different from the norm in any way? How have they made people who seem different feel unsafe or less than welcome? I ask all of us, especially white people, to examine what a Black teacher once asked in a workshop. What have you given up in order to succeed in our society? How can majority white communities look deep inside themselves for what they can do to change their environments, rather than asking BIPOC people to come in and train them how to do it. BIPOC practitioners need to be on our own paths, individually and in the communities we practice in. We cannot afford to wait for white people to get rid of racism. We need to be present to the oneness in our whole selves and with all living beings. We have to claim our liberation and collectively support one another in doing that. Reverend Angel Kyoto Williams asks us all to do that. She says, "No one who has ever touched liberation could possibly want anything other than liberation for everyone. It comes down to this. If you don't get on your path, I don't get to finish mine. We're bound. You start exactly where you are, the truth of your existence, right here and now. Know that no one has your answers. Just commit. That's your job. If you have fierce commitment to your own liberation, then you are worthy to walk on this path toward liberation for all." Thank you very much for your attention and consideration. So Ben, Ed, is there something that happens next?
Generally, if the speaker would like, you could request if people have questions or comments. And then there are announcements after that, which we usually start at about
Okay.
When the speaker wants to, or at about 10 till 11.
Okay. If there are comments or questions from the Zendo, it might be hard for me to hear them, so I might ask you to repeat. So, does anybody have Minna?
Hi, Carol.
Hi, Minna.
Thank you so much for your talk today. I think I just want to express great gratitude for your frankness and honesty in what you shared, and a great appreciation for you being here and speaking today. So, thank you.
Thank you, Minna.
Ben?
Yeah,
I have a comment.
go ahead.
So I thank you so much for your talk today. I feel just tremendous sympathetic joy at the BIPOC, the Indian community, and having a sitting group. It just feels like such an empowerment and community and being there for each other. I just think that just feels so wonderful. And thank you for expressing that to us. I'm just very joyful about that.
Thank you so much for sharing your joy.
So, Carol, I'll ask a question. I'd just like to thank you so much for this powerful and beautiful talk. Towards the end of the talk, you talked about the embodying what would be understood to be Asian traditional forms as white people. So, like, I'm wearing samoe and I'm wearing a rakusu, and I'm going to bow to you in a minute, probably several times. So, really interesting. To me, one of the conundrums I find is, given that the teachers who transmitted Zen to this community, Katagiri and Tomoe-san and Shohaku Okamura, and to some extent Suzuki Roshi, all of them seem to really value and want people to carry these forms forward, and thought of them as fundamental to what we are doing. So bowing, for priests wearing the clothing in the appropriate ways, doing the rituals, was like really a main piece of what they seem to be conveying, they were transmitting to us. or in Tomoe's case, still is transmitting to us. So it's like, this is the interesting thing that I don't need to resolve, but I would just love to hear your thoughts. How is it more appropriate to let some of those things go? Or in what way is that disrespectful of the tradition? So I just love to hear any thoughts you have on that sort of living question that we have here at MCMC.
Thank you. It is a conundrum. And it might not have been very clear in my talk, but I think that whether we have fewer forms or more, that what I think is essential is to remember and to acknowledge where they came from, and to keep that in our consciousness. I was at, I'm trying not to identify other places by name or teachers, but I was at a workshop led by a renowned white teacher, and there was a theme of racism. So I brought up the fact of so many white practicing Buddhists not acknowledging that all of these things that we associate with our Buddhist practice came from Asia. The disconnect, for example, of thinking Suzuki Roshi started Buddhism in the United States by working with white people. In fact, I even heard this teacher speak about the advent of white Buddhism beginning with Suzuki Roshi. So when I raised this issue, the teacher said, "Oh, well, I'm very conscious of the origins of Buddhism with the Chinese and Indian and Japanese ancestors because I chant this every morning." But the problem is that's a very personal practice. So what is that person doing to educate anybody in their community about something that they're apparently very aware of? So I don't think that it's a matter of shedding forms or adopting forms, but of being very mindful and keeping our communities mindful on where this all came from. Did that answer your question at all?
Absolutely. Thank you very much. Thank you. Very clear.
Are there any other comments or questions? And there are two Zoom screens. So if you just wave your hand, I don't think I will see you. So you might have to use the raise hand feature.
Ben, there's a question back here.
We got a question in the Zendo. Just raise your voice. Hopefully we can all hear you.
I was very, well, thank you first for your enlightening discussion. I was particularly interested in a comment you made early about the white approach to right concentration. And I would be quite interested to hear how BIPOC folk might approach right concentration differently. What is the contrast that you have observed?
Did you hear that okay, Carol?
Yes, I'm pausing a second.
Good.
Well, a couple things. You know, we bring our whole selves, or we think we might, to our concentration, to Zazen. And sometimes what comes up, at least for me and some other BIPOC that I know of, is all of the ways that our ancestors have suffered, we have suffered, that, you know, white society has really tried to squash a lot of people of color. So that particular sadness, that agony is part of what comes up, what can come up in concentration. I was on a sesshin once, a formal retreat, for those of you that don't know the term. And it was soon after my mother passed. And so my mother came up a lot in my sitting. And you know what I'm just so aware of is how her life was transformed in such a really negative way by being in a concentration camp for several years. She and her family. The other thing I would say is that when the BIPOC Sitting Group at Clouds and Water gets together for our weekly or our 2 Sundays a month sit, we do have sitting. We have 30 minutes of meditation. But then we also share what comes up from our hearts, what's arising. And sometimes this is in response to a prompt that one of the several people who facilitate, including myself, something that we might bring up. And so we might talk about any number of things, but they would be about, generally speaking, life as a BIPOC person. So I don't know, did I answer your question at all?
Yes.
About how concentration can be different?
You got an affirmative. Yes.
Thank you.
Carol, this is Ted.
Sure.
I would just like to thank you for being so open with us, for being so direct. You've really given us a lot to consider here, and I just feel a great deal of gratitude. Thank you so much.
Ted, thank you, and thanks to Ben for inviting me. I mean, as you know, I didn't run my talk by you for review before I gave it, so you had no idea. I mean, you might have guessed about some of the themes I might have touched on, but you really didn't know what I was going to talk about. But I felt that this was an environment where I could be really open with you about some things that are really significant in my life's work. So thank you for making that possible. I really appreciate it. And I really appreciate, you know, the different things that you are doing to make changes in how American Buddhism goes forward. Donna, I see your hand.
Thank you so much. I just wanted to express my deep gratitude for you. This is the first time I've heard a talk like this, a Dharma talk like this. that names something that is so deep to our experiences. And I'm also incredibly grateful to you for all that you've done to create a BIPOC space at Clouds and Water. So I just wanted to say that. But following from that previous question, I was just kind of wondering if there's anything that you're hoping for in making these connections. If not, that's an answer too, but I was just wondering if there's something that you're hoping for out of this. Thank you.
Thanks, Donna. Thanks always for your support. What am I hoping for? I think that, well, it depends on where someone is coming from. To some people, my message is pretty familiar, and so they will continue doing their work for racial and social justice in this world. To some, if it's less familiar, what I'm hoping is that there is a spark, especially in the way that I ended my talk, that people will really lean in to the opportunities that are available to make real change in our sanghas, real change in the communities we live in, you know, maybe even the country and the world. Okay, so to be sort of specific here, I know that MZMC, because I've corresponded with Ted about this, I know that MZMC has created a diversity and equity group. And my wish for that group is that people really lean in when they try to think of what diversity and equity mean within the spiritual community, and not make it a mental exercise. Try to imagine in your body what it feels like to be different. Try to imagine in your body what it feels like if you're white, what it feels like, and what have you given up in order to not get hassled in our society, and to try to live your true self, and in the perhaps empathy or the greater awareness, to really work on some serious change. I guess that's part of my hope. Thank you. Dantien.
I would like to express gratitude for everyone who's here and hearing the hard words that Carol has expressed. I've watched people who appear on the Zoom screen and in the Sangha, and I see great heart and receptivity that you are touched and that you are really hearing it. And I feel great gratitude for that. Thank you all for listening.
Okay, thank you again, Carol. I think it's time for us to do our announcements again.
That would be great. Thank you. Thank you again for this opportunity.